Garrett and the girl were a couple. She had cooled off towards him, but said nothing. She decided to go to study far away, in fact in another country. Garrett was against it because it was a threat to their relationship. On the western edge of Kentucky, where the hills gently sloped into the plains and the narrow roads wound through cornfields and abandoned barns, lay a small town called Havenfield. It was one of those places that tourists never visited, where mailboxes still lined the roads and the rains brought the smell of wet wood and old paint. At the center of Havenfield stood a university, small but well known in the region. Most of the young people dreamed of moving on to Chicago, to Atlanta, to the ocean. But some stayed. It was here, a few years ago, that Garrett Blake and Allison Marsh had met. He worked at a local auto repair shop with his father, and she had just entered college. She was quiet, attentive to detail, always with a book in her bag. Her eyes always seemed to look further than the horizons of the area allowed. At first, it all seemed simple. She studied, he waited for her after school. They drove together in an old pickup truck to the woods, collected acorns for the orphanage, baked cookies for charity fairs. Over the years, silence settled in these little things. Allison was graduating, but her gaze was increasingly lost somewhere beyond the horizon. She silently opened the map that hung above her desk and ran her finger over the names of cities that sounded like something more than just dots on paper. Garrett saw everything, but said nothing. He was the kind of person who would rather hide the pain inside than let it escape. It seemed to him that Allison was disappearing slowly, like fog in a morning field, imperceptibly at first, and then suddenly there was nothing but clean air. When she received a letter offering her the opportunity to continue her studies abroad at a small college in northern Canada, Garrett felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He didn't believe in long-distance travel. He had seen people get lost even within their own state. And Allison was too trusting, too gentle with a world that wasn't always gentle in return. He had asked her to stay. Not rudely, not demandingly. Just with her looks, her silence, her presence. But she had made her choice a long time ago. Her suitcase had been sitting by the door for days, a silent sign of irreversibility. One morning she had left. And the city was left without her, as if someone had torn a page out of a book and left a void. The first few days were anxious. Garrett checked his phone every hour. Her messages came less frequently than he had expected, short and distant. She wrote that she was fine, that the city was picturesque, that the people were friendly. But her words seemed too flat, as if they had passed through a filter of indifference. A month passed. Then another. And on the third, he didn't get a single message. At first, he thought it was temporary. That she had lost her phone, that she was busy with her studies. But days passed, and everything remained the same. He wrote, but he didn't get a response. The phone was silent. Social media looked empty, like an abandoned house. She had disappeared not only from his life, but from the whole world. Garrett began to search. He wrote to the college, they said that she had stopped attending classes. He called the dorm, they said that she had left a few weeks ago, without leaving an address. Only one of her former roommates remembered that Allison had talked about wanting to go to some small town to the east, closer to the lake, away from the big cities. Garrett didn't know what to do. He was not an adventurer. His whole life had been in Havenfield, the dusty road home, the garage that smelled of grease, and his mother who baked pies on Sundays. But something about him was unsettling. The feeling that she was somewhere so close, yet so out of reach. Like a radio signal fading out of frequency. One rainy morning, when the sky was low over the rooftops, a letter arrived in his mailbox. A plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a sheet of paper with a smooth, familiar handwriting. It was Allison. The letter was short, but written warmly. On plain paper, with slightly uneven edges, in a hand he recognized immediately. No signature was needed. Everything in the handwriting, in the curves of the letters, in the spaces between the words was familiar, once very close. Allison wrote that everything was fine with her. She thanked him for the time they had spent together, and recalled individual details: the smell of autumn leaves in the forest, the creak of a swing on an old tree, their Saturday trips out of town. But most of all, there was silence in her words. The kind that hides between the lines and says more than any confessions. She did not explain where exactly she was, she only wrote that she was trying to understand herself. That she had gone not to run away, but to get together. That she had thought for a long time about how to say everything, and she could not find the words. The letter was a farewell, not with warmth, but not with pain. She asked him not to look for her, and thanked him for being her support when she needed it most. Garrett reread the letter several times. He kept it in his jacket pocket for weeks, not daring to put it in the box with his other things. Something in it stopped and at the same time moved on, like a quiet river changing course after a flood, leaving its banks empty. Weeks passed. Autumn in Havenfield was always a little tired. The leaves fell slowly, as if they did not want to leave the trees, and the sky turned the color of lead. Garrett returned to his usual life. In the mornings he came to the service station, fixed engines, checked tires, tightened nuts. In the evenings he returned home, where his mother and the dog, who always lay by the stove, were waiting for him. But something in him had changed. The world was no longer purely mechanical, not reduced to details and clear lines. His thoughts became longer, and the silences deeper. Sometimes he found himself staring out the window, as if waiting for someone. Sometimes in the evenings he would spread out a map, looking for small towns by the lakes in the north, guessing where Allison might have settled. He didn't actively look for her, he didn't call anymore, he didn't write letters. But he had the idea that maybe one day she would show up again. Like people who come back when you stop waiting for them. Life went on. A new guy came to the service for an internship, and Garrett was supposed to teach him how to use the tools. A coffee shop had opened in town, and he started going there sometimes with a book. He read more than he had before, mostly stories about people who had left home and found themselves. Somewhere deep down he felt that he was trying to understand Allison, even when there was no need to. In the spring, he learned that his mother had sold a piece of land on the outskirts of town, where they had once wanted to build a house. He didn't argue. He hadn't seen himself there for a long time. Something in his plans for the future had faded, and a silence had set in, not an anxious one, but simply a quiet one. One morning, a year after Allison had disappeared, he received another letter. This time, it was postmarked from a small town in northern Michigan. In the envelope was another piece of paper, with the same cautious words. She wrote that she lived by the lake, that she worked in a library, that she was learning little by little alone, without plans or deadlines. That in the spring, wild apple trees bloomed, and every day smelled of old books and wood shavings. She hadn't invited him, she hadn't written to ask him to come. But she hadn't forbidden him. Her letter was like an open window, it didn't knock, but it wouldn't close. She wrote that she didn't know yet if he would return. That the world had changed. That she remembered him, but without pain. And that she wanted him to live his life, not expecting anything. Garrett didn't answer. He kept the letter in his drawer for a long time, rereading it when he couldn't sleep. He thought about how much had changed, although outwardly nothing seemed to have happened. People in the city saw him as the same tall, silent, with tired hands and a sincere look. But inside he had become deeper, calmer. The feeling of loss eventually turned into gratitude for the very fact that she had existed. In May he had driven north. Not to find Allison. He had simply wanted to see those places, the lakes, the hills, the towns where people lived among the woods and the fog. He had driven across Michigan, stopping at small hotels, talking to strangers at gas stations. He had not looked for her face in the crowd. He had simply wanted to be close to her choice. On one of the lakes, where the water was so calm that it reflected the sky without a single cloud, he had left a letter. Handwritten, short, unaddressed, and signed. He had placed it under a rock by the old pier that cracked in the wind. The letter was not for her, but for himself. Like a goodbye that didn't sound painful. When he got home, everything in town was as usual. People were talking about the crops, about the rising price of gasoline, about the new plans of the county council. But he was already looking at everything a little differently. He knew that not all stories end where they begin. And not all of them need a final ending. Sometimes love is not about holding on, but letting go. Not waiting, but remembering. Not looking, but knowing that somewhere in the world, someone is living their own way, carrying a piece of you inside them. And that is enough. It had been more than 2 years since the morning Allison left Havenfield. Since then, Garrett had begun to live a little differently, not the same way he had before, but not entirely new either. Life had simply become deeper, slower, filled with things that had no precise explanation but somehow had weight. He was left in a town where everyone knew everyone, where people noticed even when you cut more hair than usual. There was nothing new here except the changing of the seasons. Unless someone opened a new grocery store or repainted an old barn a lighter color. After that trip north, when he left the letter by the lake, Garrett had stopped looking for Allison, even in his mind. He no longer had any idea where she was, with whom, in what city. Not because he had forgotten, but because he had learned to let go of thoughts. Experience doesn't change people, it changes the ability to feel and perceive, and he had learned that. Things went on as usual at the service station. The engine oil, the smell of gasoline, the cold keys in his fingers in the morning. Garrett's father had stepped away from work and spent more time at home, in his armchair, looking through old photos or listening to the radio. Garrett didn't believe in big changes, but he noticed little things, how a new intern learned every tool faster than Garrett had in his youth, or how customers began to ask about hybrid repairs more often. The world was changing slowly but surely. He began to walk more. Especially in the fall, when the air became as thick as a blanket. The road to the old water tower, where he and Allison had once sat on the hood of the pickup truck, had now become his weekly path. He walked slowly, sometimes stopping by the fields where the cows stood in the morning mist like living statues. Nature didn't ask how. He was. It just was. And the silence was healing. Then he received another letter. The third in a long time. It was the same, no signature, no return address. But in a familiar handwriting, smooth, careful. Allison wasn't writing about herself, she was writing about a place. She was describing a tree that grew in the middle of the sandy road and blossomed every spring, even when winter dragged on. She remembered the smell of cinnamon from the bakery on the corner. And the boy who fed the pigeons by the library every day. It all sounded like an attempt to explain that she wasn't lost, she was just different. She didn't ask for an answer. And she didn't write what she thought of him. But every word seemed to be addressed to him. Garrett didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because this correspondence had become like something that didn't need to be exchanged. Like a prayer that didn't need to be said out loud, because God hears anyway. He didn't receive any more letters from then on. But he learned to notice their traces in his own daily life. For example, in the way he began to carry a notebook with him and write down little things. Not thoughts, but little things: the smell of apples in the new season, the sound of rain on the tin roof of the service station, the feeling of a warm wind as you walk past haystacks. These were things he had previously ignored. Somewhere in the spring his mother got sick. Not badly, but enough for him to spend more time at home. He cooked, washed dishes, reminded them of their medicine. In the evenings, they would sit on the veranda, listening to the sounds of the evening. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes she remembered something: how he first learned to hold a hammer, how he got lost in the woods in 3rd grade and found his way back. She didn't ask about Allison. Never. This silence was not cold. It was like a shelter, a shared understanding that not everything needed to be said out loud. One day at a gas station, he saw a familiar figure. A dark-haired girl in a green jacket stood by the coffee machine. His heart stopped for a second. But it wasn't her. Just an outline, a resemblance in movement. But Garrett wasn't disappointed. He simply felt again that memory lived in the bodies of strangers, in the smells, in random glances. And that was normal. He didn't start new relationships. Not because he was clinging to the past, but because he hadn't yet found a place where his heart would feel at peace in new closeness. But he wasn't lonely. The people in town loved him for his simplicity. He helped his neighbors repair roofs, carried groceries to the elderly, sometimes looked after the local sheriff's dog when he went to the county meeting. Over the years, something in him finally calmed down. He didn't search for more. He didn't analyze. He just lived. And even that just had a lot of depth. Somewhere where there had once been pain, there was now gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what had made him who he was. One day he received another letter, not from Allison. This time it was an official letter from a Northern University. One of the teachers to whom she had entrusted her name had found his address in old documents. Allison said that she was now working at a charity center, helping people who had experienced difficult life circumstances. She wouldn't be back, but she asked him to tell her that everything was fine with her. And that she still remembered the autumn in Havenfield. He put this letter next to the others. And one day, when the roof of the workshop needed repair after a strong storm, he found that box, with letters, old photos, the backs of calendars. And I realized that time passes, but meaning remains. Sometimes love is not a return, but a memory. Not a presence, but a quiet shadow on the brightest days. And when Garrett sat on the porch of his house, where the old wood was already cracking, he felt that life is not a search and not an escape. It is simply a path. And someone once walked next to you, left a trace, and you will never walk completely alone. Autumn in Havenfield came early this year. The wind became stronger, not yet completely losing its summer smell, but already carrying something in itself that reminded of the fatigue of the fields. The leaves were starting to turn yellow, but not as brightly as before. It was as if the trees themselves had become calmer, more restrained. Garrett woke up early. His days began almost the same: coffee without sugar, a short walk to the barn, a walk around the yard. He learned to live in the rhythm of the surrounding Sounds, chirps, distant barking of dogs, the creaking of a neighbor's gate. After losing contact with Allison, he had long sought silence, and finally, when she came, he had learned to live in it. The town lived by its own laws. Here, people still asked how your parents were, even if you were already graying. Here, they knew who drove what brand of car, and they remembered what your name was in kindergarten. Havenfield had not changed. And that was its strength. He worked in the service department, as always. But work no longer absorbed him as it had before. Garrett allowed himself to take more breaks, to observe, to feel the time. He wasn't looking for something new, but something new was beginning to find him. For example, a small forest shelter for wounded birds opened by a war veteran who had settled nearby. Garrett would bring wood there from time to time, help with the roof, fix the cages. Working with his hands became a way of not thinking, but simply being. He thought of Allison often, but not with sadness. Her image remained like a photograph on the wall, not sharp, not painful, but part of the background. He didn't know if he would get another letter. And he didn't wait any longer. She was there. And everything that needed to be done had already happened. One of the neighbors had sold his lot, and a small farm had sprung up in its place. The new people had come from somewhere in the south. They were friendly, but they kept a little distance. Garrett had helped them when their tractor broke down. He had just come over, looked at it, silently fixed it, and gone. They thanked him, but he didn't stay. His kindness was simple, not demanding recognition. Over time, a quiet mutual respect had developed between them. The new neighbors kept goats, grew corn, and didn't interfere in other people's lives. Garrett would sometimes help out when he saw someone was having a hard time. But no more. His world was already balanced. One day he decided to do what he had put off for years. On the site of an old barn, he began building a small greenhouse. Just for himself. To grow something with his hands, not to sell. Not for profit, just to watch something grow. He had no experience, but he read, studied. He liked starting from scratch. The tomatoes sprouted first. Then basil, a little arugula. The earth was hard at first, but he watered it every day, talking to it in his mind as if it were a living being. After a few weeks, it became softer, more generous. In the evenings, he often sat in the greenhouse with a lantern, looking at the leaves, at the small changes. All this reminded him of the process, not the result. Once he wanted to know everything in advance, how it would turn out, where the path would lead. And now he understood, the main thing is not the goal, but the path to it. One morning, as he was walking through a field, he saw a small gray bird in the grass. It was injured. He picked it up carefully, wrapped it in an old scarf, and carried it to the shelter. The veteran, the one who kept the birdhouse, took it in silently and put it in a box with warm bedding. It will survive, he said later. It's still young. Garrett nodded silently. He didn't ask how long it would take. He just knew that everything would be okay with her. And with him, too. From that moment on, he began to visit that bird. Not every day. But when he walked by, he stopped. Its appearance became a symbol of something new. It reminded him that even something that is broken can fly again. Winter came quickly. Blizzards blocked the road to the shelter, but Garrett made it anyway. He learned not to be afraid of the cold. There was an honesty about him, he hid nothing. Winter is always straightforward. At Christmas he received a letter. A thin envelope, slightly yellowed. But this time it was from a different person. Someone from the charity where Allison worked. There were no details in the letter, just a few sentences. That she was doing well. That she was helping teenagers who had lost their families. That Havenfield sometimes remembered. And that somewhere in her office there was a jar of buttons that she had once found with Garrett in an old box in the service. It was not a farewell. And not a return. It was like a slight hint, we are alive, we remember. Spring came slowly. The snow melted for a long time. But one morning he saw the first flowers in the greenhouse. And among the grass a bird. She returned. She was sitting on the roof of the greenhouse, not afraid. And this time, she flew away on her own. Garrett smiled. Not because it got easier, but because clarity came. Life doesn't ask when you're ready. It just goes. And you can either walk alongside it or stay put. But sometimes, the best thing is to just listen to the earth whisper beneath your feet. And go. Quietly. Without haste. Without pain. Without expectations. That summer had brought not only warmth but something new to the very air of Havenfield. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the dust of the broken roads, the birdsong with the echo of passing trucks. The fields rustled in the wind, and each day seemed like the last. But Garrett knew that time did not stand still, even if everything seemed to stand still. His greenhouse had grown. Zucchini, parsley, carrots had joined the tomatoes. Garrett enjoyed every little thing, the softness of the soil when he dug a hole, the tart smell when he stumbled upon a root, the chapped fingers when he worked for a long time without gloves. It was his way of talking to the earth without using words. In the spring he had put up a new fence around his yard. Not because he had to, he just wanted to create a boundary that no one would cross but that could be easily opened. The neighbors wondered why he did it himself when he could hire someone. But Garrett didn't explain. Some things have to be done by hand, so they become a part of you. One day he noticed a girl by the road. She was sitting on an old wooden box lying under a sign with a faded inscription, Havenfield, 2 miles. She had a notebook in her hands. She was writing something down. When he passed by, she looked up, but she didn't say anything. And she didn't run away. The next day she was there again. And she was writing something down again. Garrett didn't ask who she was. But later he found out that she was the granddaughter of the new neighbors who had been left for the summer. She didn't know anyone in town, she had no friends, but she was interested in the birds and the trees. Garrett saw her watching everything that moved, insects, cats, the wind in the grass. He didn't talk to her, but sometimes he left an apple or a sprig of mint on the box. She responded by leaving little drawings, a flower, a feather, a river. A silent exchange of things that didn't need explaining. Garrett felt that this girl had the same silence inside that lived inside him. The bird sanctuary had more cages. Summer is a time when many fall. Young swallows. Broken wings, weakened bodies. Garrett sometimes sat next to her, listening to the veteran talk about how the sky changes in different countries. But Garrett didn't listen to the words, he listened to the voice. The tone was calm, like an evening on the porch. He didn't need stories to understand, the man just wanted someone to be there. In the evenings, Garrett often stayed in the greenhouse. The world was different. There, cozy, humid, filled with aromas. He learned to distinguish the varieties of seeds by touch, by smell. He wasn't lonely. Loneliness is when you're waiting for someone. And he hadn't been waiting for anything for a long time. One day, when the sky was heavy and gray, people from the city came to Havenfield. They We're looking for old farms to film a documentary about rural life. They walked the streets, took a few photos, asked questions. Garrett didn't answer. But when one of them asked permission to film his greenhouse, he didn't object. He silently unlocked the door and walked away. When the film was broadcast on local television, Garrett didn't watch it. But his neighbors said the footage of his greenhouse was the warmest. The people from the city saw something real in it, but they couldn't explain what it was. Garrett wasn't surprised. Some things are not meant to be seen, but felt. By the end of the summer, the path leading to the shelter had become overgrown with grass. Fewer people came. But Garrett kept walking. Sometimes he carried boxes of food. Sometimes he just walked to check the nets. One day he saw a bird they had rescued in the spring feeding its young. It was proof that what seemed weak could give new life. A girl sitting by the road once left a note. A small piece of paper attached to a branch. It had just one word written on it, "Thank you," and a small drawing of a greenhouse with a light inside. Garrett folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and never saw it again. Autumn came slowly this time. The trees held on to their leaves for a long time, as if they didn't want to let go of the heat. Garrett harvested the last of the harvest, gave some to his neighbors, and buried some in the ground as a thank you for her generosity. He didn't believe in rituals, but he knew, everything you take, you have to give back. One night it started to rain. He walked for several hours without a break, heavy and steady. Garrett lay in bed, listening to the drops hitting the roof, and thinking about the past. Not with longing, but with gratitude. Everything that had happened had brought him here, to silence, to the soil, to peace. When he went outside in the morning, he noticed that the ground had sagged a little under the weight of the moisture. But the greenhouse stood firm. And in the middle, near the wall, something new had sprouted, something he hadn't planted. Perhaps the seeds had been blown by the wind. But it had sprouted. Exactly. Without a plan. Without permission. Simply because it could. And then Garrett understood, all of life is a field. You can sow something, tend it, water it. Or you can do nothing and still something important would grow. If the earth were left alone. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew what would happen. And that was enough. The winter that year had lasted longer than usual. The sky was gray almost every day, and the sun only appeared occasionally, a silent golden lantern that reminded him that it existed somewhere above the clouds. Garrett spent most of his time in the greenhouse. It was almost empty now, except for a few pots of mint and one plant that had grown on its own. Without his intervention. It held up, though it swayed under the weight of the cold. The shelter was quiet. Most of the birds had wintered elsewhere. Only a few remained. Among them one of the ones Garrett had found in the field the year before. Her wing hadn't fully grown, but she had learned to live with it. They called her simply Gray. She didn't fly far, but she always came back. Garrett began to notice a fatigue in her body. It didn't come suddenly. It settled gradually, in the fingers that gripped the tool more slowly, in the feet that climbed the steps more slowly. He was not afraid of it. He knew that the body tells a person when it is time to stop. One morning he woke up very early, even earlier than usual. There was absolute silence outside. The wind did not move, there was not even a mist above the ground. Garrett, dressed, slowly went out into the yard and walked to the greenhouse. He opened the door and stopped. The plant that had grown by itself had bloomed that morning. A small white flower, almost transparent, glowed in the darkness. Garrett bent down to get a better look. He had never planted anything like it. This flower was foreign. Unusual, as if not from this area. But at the same time it was the only one that had bloomed. In the middle of winter. He sat down next to him and did not move for a long time. The gray bird appeared as dawn broke. It flew past the greenhouse, sat on the edge of the window, and tilted its head quietly, as if it understood something. Garrett looked at it and smiled faintly. When a neighbor came a few hours later to wish him a happy new year, Garrett didn't answer. He sat as he always did, calmly, with his palm on the ground, and a self-sowing flower blooming next to him. No one knew what had happened. But they didn't ask. In Havenfield, they knew that sometimes people don't leave when they die, but when they are full. And nothing more is needed. The greenhouse wasn't destroyed. It was left. People came from time to time, just to look. The girl who had once sat with her notebook on the box came with her parents in the spring. She left the flower from the drawing on the doorstep. And the gray bird disappeared. They say she was seen for a few more weeks, but then she wasn't. Maybe she flew further than she could have before. Garrett didn't leave much behind. But he left something that remained with the silence. Footprints in the soil, slow breathing, the ability to not disturb the peace of the earth. And that was more than enough.